Thanks, Frank.
Who needs friends when you got Frank?
So I'm going to close tonight by saying a few more words about forgiveness, thinking about the forgiveness of the Father. As I've said, there are some lingering questions in the parable of the prodigal son, and lingering questions about our relationship between us and God. So I'm going to try and bring together some of the things I've said the last few days, and I'm going to end with taking a few things that David has said and around the end of the last few slides here, trying to pull some of our different threads together as best I can. See how it goes. As I closed with yesterday morning, it was a long time ago, but it wasn't. I ended by getting us to puzzle over this odd situation we have with this family of prodigals. We tend to focus on the son as the prodigal one, since he wanders off and squanders and comes back destitute and in need of forgiveness. But I said, we also notice how the elder brother, right, has similar problems of prodigalness. He's been there the whole time, he hasn't physically gone anywhere. But he seems to have an understanding of his status as a son and his brother's status as brother that links them to performance in some way. If you don't do the right things, or if you do the wrong things, you are essentially disowned from the family. So it's a puzzle, I said. How is it that both of these boys have the same mistake in this family? And obviously when we have human families, we let people off the hook, because human parents are less than perfect. And certainly father-in-laws are less than perfect.
Oh.
Nevertheless, we love them anyway. Nevertheless, when it comes to the divine Father, things get a little more complicated. If we take the parable of the prodigal son as a story of God and us, which we don't have to, but if we want to play that interpretive game for a bit, it raises questions, I think, for how is it that the father has gotten in this situation with two misdirected sons? Wrong ideas going in wrong directions. So, let me begin by talking about how we blame our parents. It's a fun activity for all of us. It's sort of a trope, right, in a lot of television shows and sort of pop images of therapy and psychology that you simply lay on the couch, talk about how your mom and dad wronged you in some way, and how they caused all of these problems in your life. But I think it's a trope with some genuine insights. We've all come to recognize, in a way that not everyone in the past always did, quite as clearly, that we are dependent, vulnerable social creatures. So many of our habits, our behaviors, our attitudes, our likes and dislikes are shaped at a very young age by the things that our closest people do to us and in front of us, knowingly and unknown. The ancients actually had some similar insights. Aristotle was fairly well convinced that in order to be virtuous in this life, you had to be born a man. Good times. And he also liked to be born with some relative wealth and into the right kind of family, etc., etc. Just a certain amount of luck to have the right starting conditions. And I think our instincts to say that family and your parents are important press us in many ways in our lives to wrestle with questions of responsibility. We encounter people whose lives have seemed so misshaped and malformed by the families and communities that created them. We start to wonder, can I even hold this person accountable anymore for their actions? It's a genuine wrestling we have. The criminal justice system often seems ill-disposed to handle this kind of stuff, nor do we as a society. But sometimes we reach the conclusion that sometimes excuse and exculpation are limited and warranted, but still wanting to hold on to a sense of responsibility and action. It might be true that your father was a jerk. It might be true that he was mean and cruel, but we often hold out some hope and hold you accountable in some way, trying to correct that as best you can in this life, even just to recognize that. respond as best you can accordingly. What we try to avoid is this kind of scenario, where everybody is pointing to someone else to take responsibility for what has happened and what is wrong. Around and around we go. Where it stops? Well, nowhere. This is an infinite loop here, right? I cut off the bottom of this cartoon. It said the Trump administration. So I didn't want to get too political. The point the political cartoon was making, though, I think, makes a bigger one about trying to pass responsibility off to someone else whenever you can. It's part of the reason this president, right? Truman had this little sign that he put on his desk. The buck stops here. It's a way to sort of stop this passing responsibility on and on, around and around. So, let's talk about somebody who thought a lot about this. St. Augustine, or Augustine, if you want to go that way. I'll say Augustine. This means a little dated, but I still like it. Church fathers ranked. It is not possible to rank the fathers as they all were integral parts of a single continuing conversation. Oh yeah, Augustine. I love this meme. I love Augustine, and I think it really works. It's hard to imagine Christianity as we understand it in the West without Augustine. The East tries to keep him at arm's length sometimes, but I think a lot of his ideas are still there. So we'll leave it at that. It's maybe been a while since you've perused Augustine's Confessions. If you haven't read it in a while, I commend it to your reading. But you may or may not recall when Augustine wrote this little book called Confessions. I say he was essentially trying to get ahead of the story. He had been installed as a bishop, and people were talking. They were saying, oh, this Augustine guy is a bishop now. Wasn't he the guy who used to have a lot of sects and talk about it? Wasn't the guy who was like really into career advancement, getting rich, making big fat stacks of dinars? I don't know. Right. And so he wants to explain his life, how he's gotten to where he is, and let the people who he's going to be leading know about himself. So in his early chapters about his youth, Augustine discusses his parents' failings, mainly his dad's failings. In Augustine's mind, this is his mom. His mom is perfect in almost every way. Except there are two instances that I'm aware of in his writings where Augustine criticizes his mom, sort of obliquely. He points out that like, she yelled at one of their servants one time because she'd had too much wine. There seemed to be some sort of indication that she might have had a bit of a drinking problem that he doesn't like to wrestle with too much. But his mom was great. He thinks his dad is the worst sort of tortured father relationship. And why does he complain about his dad and his parents in general, but his dad in particular? Well, in his confessions, he says, listen, I was a young kid. I was really horny, to put it bluntly. And instead of giving me a wife to control my lusts, my parents just kind of turned their eyes away and let me run off. And my mom was a Christian. His dad, he'd go to church on Christmas and Easter. But they didn't think that him being raised up in the faith was all that important. At least it didn't seem that way to Augustine. Because they were really focused on him doing better at his life as a rhetorician. Think of it as like the parents want their kid to become a great doctor or a great lawyer, and get into the best schools. Spiritual stuff, gotta climb that ladder. And so Augustine is sort of mad at his parents about this. He kind of, blames them for it. Why didn't you get me a wife? Why didn't you bring me up in the faith earlier? But because of the kind of person Augustine is, he also has to think about his bigger parental problems, namely God. As often as he looks at his own parents and their failings as he sees them in his life, he also wonders, wait a second, God, where were you actually during all of these times as well? I was falling into fornication, and I was chasing after honor and glory. Was this a part of your plan, God? Were you there or not there? He doesn't really answer those questions. They just sort of linger in the pages between the lines. And then, of course, we get to the chapter in the book people most pay attention to, the old stealing of the pears. You guys remember that one? Yeah. Pear tree? The story, as Augustine tells it, is he's back home on spring break, sort of room springer. He hooks up his old teenage buddies. They go out one night and they start stealing some pears. And you think, why would I care about this, Augustine? Right? It's like, oh, we did some really cool stuff when I was 16. We went to the 7-Eleven and we got giant large slushies and a small slushy cup. Small, yeah, we only paid for the smalls and stuff out. We're drinking. It was so awesome. It's like if you're going to complain about your crimes, it's like the pettiest of crimes you complain about, like pear theft, on a random farm in North Africa. But it's really important to Augustine. Why? He wants to work through and think about why he stole the pears. And he starts working through all the reasons that would explain why he did it. Were they beautiful pears? Not really. Oh, they were delicious pears. Nope. Must have been hungry. Not hungry at all. Why in the hell did you steal the pears? He said, I had no reason. There's no reason to do it. I just wanted to do evil for evil's sake. Be bad for the sake of being bad. This creates a puzzle. Remember a couple days ago I said that whenever we do something bad, we always tell ourselves that it must be good in some way, right? I know I shouldn't steal, but it's not really a big problem. My friends are doing it, we won't get caught. This is how we work. But not here. Augustine has to insist there is absolutely no explanation, nothing good at all that I was seeking. Why? Because it's really a story about Adam and Eve. Why is it that my parents, my grandparents, stole that fruit? Did it look really good? Just were mistaken? That can't be right. Did they not know they weren't supposed to eat it? Well, that can't be right either. Were they really hungry? Low on vitamins, scurvy? Needed some vitamin C? Oh. There can't be any explanation for it. As if there is, something's wrong with the garden. Right? A perfect God created a perfect garden, perfect creatures. Suddenly choose to do something less than perfect. Something doesn't add up. So Augustine tries to figure this puzzle out. And these are puzzles that we, of course, inherit as heirs of an Augustinian friar who had his own wrestling, not with stealing the pears, but his own existential knowledge. And I'm going to greatly simplify things, but it comes down to, let's say, 2 points. Everything is dependent on God. God is the only creator we know of. Fairly committed to that. And yet, Augustine, and I want to say sometimes, only some things are dependent on God. It's hard to make those two go well together. They don't play nicely. There are a couple different ways to try and resolve the tension. You can try and insert free will of some kind. Why is it that humans went wrong and did evil? Well, Pelagius would say humans are given some kind of free will. God steps back and says, give it your best. I'll judge you accordingly. That's what the medievals around Luther's time said as well. There has to be some moment, some contribution, some minimal effort that humans make where God is not responsible. God closes God's eyes, counts to 3. I open my eyes because I want to see any fruit in your mouth. Augustine doesn't know what to do with this. He ends up creating this idea of deficient causes. Aristotle says something has a deficient cause, something that causes it. He says evil has a deficient cause. If you sort of Google what's a deficient cause, only place you'll find it is Augustine. Well, I know there can't be any deficient cause, because that has to be God. So we're going to call this a deficient cause. You ask what that is. God's prepared hell for people who ask such kind of questions. Puzzle. Other ways to try and solve it end up in these weird kind of dualisms. And I honestly have to think that sometimes Luther slips into this in his rhetoric and polemic. It sort of gets away from it. This would be saying something like, all good deeds are to God's credit, all bad deeds are to humanity's fault. I don't think Luther actually believes this. I'm going to say why in a second. But sometimes he sounds like he believes it. There's a tension at least. One of the reasons why these puzzles and tensions arise, I think, is that theology, as we've been thinking about it, is a reflection on the scriptures, on our life with God, interpreting ourselves and our world, usually to try and answer a particular question. Augustine wanted to answer a question about why the Pelagians were wrong. Luther wanted to answer a question about why Rome was wrong. A particular issue. When you find a solution to one question, an answer, there might be other questions sort of lingering in the background. You just didn't get around to it. Couldn't think about it. Augustine and others wanted to absolve God for responsibility and avoid Manichaean dualism. This idea that there's a good God or a bad God, fighting it out. Don't want any of that. Have to have one God responsible for everything except for the evil part. In Luther's time, there was this real strong sense that if Luther's ideas were right about justification, everybody would stop doing anything good at all. And people kept saying that to Luther. And he was like, yeah, I know what to tell you. This is where I am on justification. Motivating good behavior isn't enough of a reason for me to think justification is different than I think it is. So, that's what I have to do. Thoughts about God's requirements for justice and the need for punishment. And finally, lingering thoughts in Augustine, in Luther, and in many folks today about how in the world are we going to justify hell. Scriptures talk about it, Lutherans preach about it. I kid you not, I was watching TV late last night before. I didn't have a little channel guide card next to me. I couldn't find it. I put it somewhere. I'm not getting out of bed. I'm just going to sit here and push buttons until it comes up. I came across Pat Robertson. He's not looking good. No offense. But he's still going. He's still up there. And serendipitous. He was up there, and a caller had written in about, like, how do I talk to my family about having faith? I'm worried about them having faith. And Pat Robertson's pitch was, well, listen, someday you're going to die. And you're going to go to heaven, you're going to go to hell. So you got to make a decision now. Once you die, that's it. Going up, you're going down. Decide today. Buy now. Operators are standing by. If I was watching that as a non-Christian, or as a Christian, oh, I understand. So you believe in God, so you don't go to hell. So your love of God is motivated by a fear of punishment. That's interesting. When Luther's at his best, I would say that he sees the problems and faces them head on. And he does that best, I think, in Bondage of the Will. Now, some people will tell you that he wrote Bondage of the Will, then he sort of put it to the side, didn't go back to it. And it's true he doesn't go back to it very often. Part of the reason is it doesn't preach well. And it's hard to figure out what to do with it pastorally. So we just sort of put it over here, and I'll go back to saying some other things when I'm preaching and teaching. But in Bondage of the Will, which I, again, encourage to your reading, Luther rejects Erasmus's efforts and others to carve out a space where God idly waits for human actions for justification. And Luther gets really twisted, Erasmus. And if you read Erasmus's work, it's very long, very difficult to follow. He's all over the place. And it's sort of like, maybe this, maybe that. Like, maybe free will, maybe not free will. Maybe fire's hot, maybe fire's cold, but God wants it to be cold. Who knows? Here's a passage, here's another passage. And it goes back and forth, for many, many pages, trying to like play every side of the argument in a way that makes him sort of look like he's playing the peacemaker, bringing everyone together. Look, there's a lot of different ideas on this. You know, all lives matter. Move forward. So, this is Erasmus's move here. Could not myself. Probably could. Luther, of course, comes back at all of this after insulting Erasmus repeatedly, as is his practice. It says that humans are either written by God or the devil, period, full stop. There's no in between, there's no neutral, it's one or the other. You're a donkey, and get used to it. But then there are moments in Bondage of the Will where Luther has to say, but of course, even if you're being ridden by the devil, God has to be responsible for that. Does that mean that God is the author of sin? Well, moving on. Seriously, that's kind of how it goes. What Luther eventually settles on is he says, well, even if God is responsible for all of these things, humans are still responsible because we do evil willingly. You can't sort of blame the devil for you doing wrong because you wanted to do it. It was your will that said this was a good thing to do. And that's all it takes to make you responsible. The fact that you have that will, that's really important. This is a hotly contested thing in sort of the philosophical, there are other debates today. People debating predetermination, sort of the universe being organized in a never-ending chain of cause and event. And a lot of the debate circles around, if everything that caused you to be who you are was determined by something else, are you still responsible? Are you still free? And Luther would say, well, who cares? If it's true that everything's predetermined, then you believing it or knowing it doesn't really change anything. All that's important in today is that you do the things that you believe are good, bad, or good in some respect. And that's what makes you responsible. That's all you really need for responsibility. And that works for how we treat each other. Because we're all kind of on the same plane of existence within these things happen. It's being more complicated for God. So, next little section here. Reciprocity and dependence. As I said, we have a problem with this family. And I've tried to show why I think the son has to offer some kind of apology to the father, where the elder brother goes wrong. I'm going to focus now on issues with the father and where apology and forgiveness might be needed. So, to make it clean and simple, I have one slide. The children, what do they need? They need to apologize to the father for their wrongdoing. They need to say, Dad, we've sinned against you and against heaven. We've done what we ought not to have done. We need you to forgive us. They have to take responsibility, even given the fact that they grew up in a family where many things didn't go quite right. And they need to receive forgiveness. They need to hear back from their father or feel from their father's hug and warm embrace, the father's commitment to them in this relationship. That their status is not dependent on their sinful nature, and their future together is assured because the father won't let go of them. There's another side I want to suggest. The father. There's a sense, I think, in the parable of the prodigal son in our life together with God. The father stands needing to apologize as well. There is a family system that makes all of this necessary. The father is the father of a broken home, of broken children. There's nobody in another house or another universe or another creation the father can point to say that it's their fault. At the same time, I would posit that the father also needs something like forgiveness. Namely, the children's acceptance of the father's apology and the children's commitment to their relationship, to their status, and to their future together. My idea here is that these things have to be balanced and equal and reciprocal. When they're not, we get into all kinds of potential problems. If we take out any of these pieces, I suspect, something falls down. Something breaks. Let me pull out two of the pieces to show you what I mean. What happens if we just blame the father? Let's go that route. It's only dad's fault. It's not our fault. Well, as you can see, that puts us right back in the garden. I love Genesis 3. Tragic, but it's also beautifully crafted. As you recall, as you see on the board here, right? God shows up and starts asking questions. Everyone starts pointing fingers at everyone else. Everyone has fingers. The serpent doesn't have fingers, apparently. It isn't allowed to point anything. It's like that in the story. The woman, she did it. They've been doing that now for 100,000 years. The woman was a serpent. The serpent tricked me. There's a sense that when we don't take responsibility of what we've done, we slip into this ongoing cycle of trying to blame someone else. Even if blaming someone else is kind of right in a way, the serpent did trick Eve. And in one reading of the story, Eve does bring the fruit to Adam. They're not wrong about the order of events. They're just wrong in trying to escape their own responsibility. They're wrong in trying to make somebody else take the fall for what they did. So no one takes responsibility, no one apologizes. And this is one of the fears that a lot of people have when we talk about God and evil and sin. If you start saying that God is somehow implicated in all of this, then people are going to say, well, then I have an excuse to do whatever the hell I want. It's a genuine fear and a genuine worry. That's what happens if you only have the blaming the father side of the equation. What happens if you just blame the children? Damn deficient causing kids. Make them a good garden, give them a good dinner, clothes on the back, or not, I guess I suppose. Do all this stuff to make things perfect for them, and they just go and screw it up. Kids. Well, then you end up with what I call Operation Unexpected Rescue. God tried to make a perfect garden. We messed it up. God, of course, was surprised by this, and certainly annoyed. So God has to jump in and fix things by sending Jesus. So then Jesus comes flying in. Clean up a mess, solve problems.
One more time.
I couldn't decide which way I wanted to fly in. Okay. In this approach, incarnation and crucifixion become optional. If only Adam and Eve had done what they were supposed to do, there'd be no need for Jesus to become incarnate, to walk and live among us, to eat, to teach, to suffer, to die, as he is. Plan B. This also, I think, comes across in some of, I'm paraphrasing loosely here, some of the less than pastoral moments when people talk about God's grace. It essentially sounds to me like, I didn't have to forgive you or save you, you know. God's grace is a gift. You didn't deserve it. have to give it to you. Be thankful. Imagine a parent saying that to a child. Any moment, childhood to the grave. You would think that's a crappy parent. There are times I've come close to saying this. Maybe I've gone down the line. Particularly when I've worked really hard to make dinner. I do a lot of cooking in my house. I've been in the kitchen for 2 hours. Here you go. I don't want this.
You what?
Back in my mom used to say, like, there are children starving in Ethiopia or Africa. That's sort of the trope of the 80s, I think. That's in the back of my mind. I don't say those words, but they're in my mind still. It's like some children somewhere are really hungry. I just spent a lot of hours, you know how lucky you are? Don't say that. But I think it. Consider. So. I love Jack Candy's deep thoughts. If the kid gets an answer right, tell him it was a lucky guess. That way he develops a good lucky feeling. This is how some theological systems treat God's grace and Christ's salvation. Why did you get it and somebody else didn't? You got lucky. I don't feel so lucky. Yeah, I do, but what about him over there? This is why the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which I know the function of it is to sort of serve as a warning. It's a function about if you don't believe a person back from the dead, if you don't believe the law, you're not going to believe Jesus' resurrection. There's all these things in that story. But it's also a story where somebody is sitting in heaven and can see and hear someone being tormented in hell. Like from here to maybe the back of this room. I'm not sure how far right there. It's a weird story. Don't much do with it. Here, what ends up happening is either God is somehow not in control in some moment and has to work hard to reassert God's control, or God is capricious. Now, some folks are okay with this. A lot of my Calvinist friends. A lot of my Lutheran friends. Particularly if you feel like you're the one who got lucky. Well, I mean, but by the grace of God go I, not you. You're left with questions about why. Again, this gets back to my worries and my suspicions about language of unconditional gifts and conditionality. There's a sense in which it makes sense to me that it's not conditioned by my behavior or attitudes. Sometimes the gratuity is ratcheted up so high that it doesn't make any sense as to why God is choosing to give it a role that why it needs to be there at all in the first place. So let's go back to the story. Prodigal family. This encounter between the elder brother and dad. The son has just blown up his dad, angry at his mistreatment, and the father says, "Son, you're always with me, all that is mine is yours, but we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found." Emphasize the word had. The had doesn't mean, I think, that there is no choice for the father, or that the prodigal son himself could demand forgiveness. That doesn't seem right. The prodigal son says, "I'm back, and you have to forgive me. If that's what you do." We miss the apology, we miss the return, we miss the son coming back to himself, being able to understand and receive any kind of forgiveness. Dad still says had. I think that means the father who wants his sons to live and be found does not see forgiveness as a choice for him or them. The father understands forgiveness is what the father has to do. It might be described as a gift. It's a gift the father can't imagine not giving and still dreams the father. It's sort of a choice. if the father chose not to give it, then he would be choosing not to be the father anymore. He'd be choosing to receive slaves back instead of sons. So, what does that leave us? What to do with this father who's in this predicament? Well, I think, as I said before, the father stands in need to offer an apology. And the story as we have it in the prodigal son fits nowhere near this. We're left with this big question mark hanging in the story. The elder brother is angry, the dad said his piece, and we don't know what happens next. Let me think about this for a second with you. If the father were to apologize for the situation that everyone is sitting in, the father would have to be able to tell a story that makes sense of the good and the bad, the joy and the suffering, the prodigal son's exit return, the elder son's anger, and reconciliation. Something that's going to tie all of this together. It's going to own the past, like apologies do, but also say that something different is going on for a future everyone's living into. So the father's apology, just like ours, has to tie together God's past, present, and future into some kind of coherent identity. As much as that past, present, future language even makes sense for God, but we'll go with it for our purposes. So that's what it has to look like, just like our apologies. What would this apology actually say? Just give you kind of the shape of it. Here's where it gets stickier. This is why I'm not going to give you a theodicy at the end of my lecture. Theodicy is presumed to do the work that is God's work. What kind of story could God tell that would make sense of this broken family and its eventual reconciliation? Just like I can't offer an apology for anyone else in this room, this mother party, none of us can offer an apology for God. That's God's work to do. Am I going to try and guess at what God's apology is? Yeah, good. I didn't guess right? Well, probably not. Generally, when folks try and offer a theodicy, they're trying to give this apology for God's situation. They do so in ways that encourage suffering and provoke wrongdoing. By that I mean their explanations for evil in this life. And I think the best of our explanations are coping mechanisms of some kind. Because we're all afraid, and we're all vulnerable, and we're all weak, and we're all sometimes on the edge of despair, and we need something to sort of keep us off the edge. We have some kind of story for why there's evil. Two of the common ones, right, are that, well, suffering makes you stronger and better in this life in some sense. Yeah. There's a kernel of truth to most all of these. When I look at myself on the slopes, not counting my fall on Tuesday, and I look back at how I was when I started out years ago, oh, I've gotten marginally better. Nobody else did that. Frank and coaching me on, my children skiing past me, motivating me to try harder. I did that. My kids are really excited, like, I want to help, I'm going to do it. And they do it, and it's not as good as I think it could be. They feel really good for doing it, and that's the point. In some ways, there is a truth in the fact that when we fall down and get up and pick ourselves up, when we overcome obstacles, when we endure things we didn't think we could, we can come out on the other side stronger, more confident, more appreciative of the things we have in our life. Kernel of truth in there. Around that kernel of truth is a whole lot of horrendous evil and suffering for which there is no such explanation, which is the real thing we care about when we're asking these questions. There's the old best possible world defense. This is sort of Leibniz and other folks. Well, whatever the explanation is, we know this is the best possible world. If you look at this world and think it's the best possible, then I question your definition of best. Right? Lack of imagination. I can imagine a world that's better. Now that sounds arrogant, given that God is better than I am and God created this world. say that this is the best, but I know that's the truth. Only God actually knows that. I haven't heard God's explanation quite yet. Back to bondage of the will. At the end of bondage of the will, Luther pulls on this medieval image of three lights to make a case for three different ways of seeing our world and our place in it with God. He says we can see the world with the light of nature, which he describes as reason without faith. He says if this is how we see the world, we're generally going to think that either God does not exist or that God is evil. And Luther's not just making a rhetorical point here. If you look at the world and all the suffering and the pain and things that happen, particularly the good people, children who don't have parents who love them and make them nice dinners, you don't think that in some small way God doesn't be there, that God's goodness seems absent. Luther thinks you're not paying attention to the actual world as we have it. You can cover up with Hallmark cards and little trinkets from Christian bookstores all you want, but you're in some sort of state of denial about this. But he doesn't say that's all we have. In the light of grace and faith in Christ, we know that in Christ there is a promise, a desire for the forgiveness and salvation of all humankind. Christ has come to find the lost, to seek out the coins, to find the prodigal sons, to hold them, to put robes on them, shoes on their feet, rings on their fingers, and celebrate with the whole community. No one gets to stay outside. But this is what faith enables us to believe. And our faith is a little bigger than a mustard seed in those moments when it springs forth. In the end, there's the light of glory. In this light, it'll all make sense. We'll have the revealed God in Christ who desires all to be saved and forgiven, reconciled to this hidden God who doesn't seem to have those same desires. Right now they seem to be fighting each other. Luther says, then they won't. What will that look like? None of us are there yet. We're not quite sure. This is Luther's idea. Y'all with me? All right. So I'm going to close in by offering just a couple of ways of tying some of these points together and thinking about how this might affect in whatever ways how you go about your work, your churches, and your lives, preaching or otherwise. I think I have 6 of these. I was tweaking. We'll see how many there actually are. Okay. First thing I want us to think about as we close, as we go forward. I hope you've been gathering from my times pedantic wandering details and alternatives that I think the examples we choose and use really matter. For example, a few days ago, when I was talking about sometimes we exempt certain people from responsibility for needing to apologize and be forgiven because of their status, I gave us, a baby? Can't be too angry at babies. When Luther is talking about the law, how the law confronts us, how we respond to the law only out of fear of punishment, the law curbs us and bridles us. The 2 examples he gives, particularly in his second Galatians lectures, are children and criminals. Go double check the Galatians commentary. Children and criminals. The law convicts, the law curbs, like it would for children and for criminals. I understand Luther's point. That seems like not the greatest example to describe the varieties of ways we encounter others and ourselves. There is one particularly comical moment, I find it comical, hope others do as well, where Luther is discussing adultery, stepping out on his fast. And he says that he avoids adultery to avoid the hangman's noose. I like to imagine Katie Luther in the background. Right? What are you talking about? That's the only reason you don't cheat on me? That's a pretty shitty reason not to cheat on me. Right? Don't you love me? And care about our relationships? Do you value the trust and fidelity we built? The norms for how we no, it's the hangman's noose thing that's keeping you faithful? Luther's trying to drive home a point about how so often we only respond out of some sort of lesser good when we do anything remotely wicked good. I work really hard on this sermon because I'm afraid that somebody will make fun of me or I'll look bad in the congregation or the bishop stopping by today. I've been more nervous sometimes in some sermons. My motivations are all kind of mixed and all kind of dirty. All these sort of things that are lesser reasons move me to do things when in a better world, with a better Anthony, I'm being moved by better reasons. But they're right about that. But other examples might be better too. This spills over into our thinking about forgiveness. As I said, we think about forgiveness as pardon, and we're locked into that in a legal, juridical way, then this is our God. Pretty fancy. God sitting on the throne, Christ bore the cross, right? Ready to stand in judgment. Not the warmest of images, in my mind. Not quite the Jesus I've seen in the Gospels most of the time. He's hanging out with fisher peoples on beaches, breaking bread, walking on the road to Emmaus, letting people's hearts be warm because he opens the scriptures to them. But one way to look at God. You can also do you can also do God the pardoner in the economic sense of forgiving your debts. God is the banker supreme, canceling out all your loans. Feels really good. My student loans get forgiven for all these years in the church. Sweet money, Joe Biden. Right? Really hoping that works out for me. Seminary wasn't cheap. But also not terribly warm and inviting. I've never been moved to hug my banker or my loan officer. All the people they might meet. Whereas the prodigal son story gives us this. Father breaking down to embrace the son who is broken. And hope perhaps that the son will embrace the father in his own brokenness. And they'll find out how they are dependent and needy of each other. Seems a little closer, at least in my mind, to the Jesus I encountered in the Bible. Hell. I want to say that hell makes sense as an affirmation of human responsibility, as a way of reminding folks that there are genuine consequences, that you can't keep passing the buck, that the harms and wrongs you do harm and wrong other people, and harm and wrong yourself. I get all that. As an account of God's power and love, doesn't make any sense at all. Open to debate in the Q&A about this one, but essentially, hell is God's eternal acceptance of failure. God wraps the books, closes things up, and says, I did my best, it's good enough, but you couldn't get to you, didn't work, moving on. God's gifted language. The gift of a relationship with God is one that God gives to creation, and I want to say, and to God's self. It's unconditional, only insofar as it's conditioned on God's desire to not give up. And that God also has a sense of gratitude, joy, and delight. Maybe there's even a happy exchange of some kind. I think somebody somewhere wrote about that. That if we don't talk about God's grace as a gift for us, without talking about God's grace as a gift for God as well, then we're only putting out half the picture. Suffering. The pain and suffering we cause and endure are real. God does not merely pass the buck on to us, as we so often do. By this I mean we like to engage in a lot of victim blaming in our world. And I don't think that God does that. And yet, attempts to explain God's ultimate apology and the contours of forgiveness will always be incomplete at best. The suffering and the pain are real. The family really is broken. How the father got to this condition is somewhat unknown. But we yearn and hope for that final story that explains it all and the reconciliation where only forgiveness reigns. Repentance. So sort of leading into Lent for all of y'all out there who have some Lent sermons to write in the next couple of weeks. We have to emphasize that our status as children of God is not in question because God has provided the answer in Christ. God has borne out God's commitment of eternity to His creation that God has created. But the quality of our relationship with God and our siblings remains damaged. This is what repentance is all about at the end of the day. Not about becoming God's children again, but simply becoming better children and better siblings. Which I think makes sense. To say that God accepts us as horrible children is both true and false. God will always accept us as children. God would like us to be better to each other. Those can both be true of our divine family and our human ones, I suspect. Finally, pulling in some hope from this morning. I'm going to try to insert some non-Lutheran sources when I can. Thomas Aquinas, doesn't get invoked many times in Lutheran contexts, describes hope as an object of a good thing that is difficult to obtain, and therefore requires the help of others. What does Aquinas mean by that? Well, he thinks there are certain things for which we yearn that are good for us, yet we know that we can't get there on our own. And so that's where hope steps in and says, there are others who will help you get there. Far apart from optimism, sort of a admission of dependence to need. And when it comes to God, the thing we're hoping for is that great reconciliation. So it checks despair and presumption. And so if we're going to preach hope and do so high on forgiveness, I think we have to point to the real, yet imperfect, presence of forgiveness in our lives. Lifting up examples of prodigal sons and prodigal fathers who have found ways to apologize, however imperfectly, and to reconcile whatever conditions they're able to muster to keep the relationships going. We point to the others here, and as we're here. This was my fresh edition this afternoon. It's a fresh action. I was thinking of reading one. I also want to think that when we leave this place, and we all come down to the mountaintop, that part of our hope can be in the fact that there are others like us, scattered about across the country, who are doing some of the same kind of work, that are in congregations, that are in communities, that are trying to find ways to apologize for their shortcomings and their failings, trying to find ways to forgive those who they can, wrestling with those they find they can't, knowing what not to do with that. So even though we don't have the final answer to God's story quite yet, we can lean upon and use each other's stories, knowing that there are others out there just like us, wrestling and trying the same sorts of ways. So we can depend on the work that we are doing and depend on the work that others are doing. I know that Mark and Joel, Joe, Charlie, and everyone out there is going to be doing their best in their congregation, just like I am. So I can do my best. We can lean on each other, help each other, remind each other of our identity, and share our stories, and take our stories out and bring our stories back next time. Keep doing our best to keep the light burning while things become brighter than they are now. We hope they'll be bright enough to keep us going. So, that's my hope. I hope it's been a good week for all of you.
David, want to come up?
Do you want to, I know whoever goes, there's some questions about that. Do you want to give a few minutes and I'll
Yeah,
jump
we'll
in?
start with questions for Anthony.
Yeah, then I'll jump in.
Yeah.
Otherwise I just stand up there quiet.
That's good.
I've been pacing for an hour, I'm freezing, so I can't imagine how cold it is.
I think it, say more about implications for teaching or congregational life, things to talk about.
Sure. Moving quickly.
Yeah. These are the things that you think that it implies for preaching in congregation. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Things you might do quick.
No, it was interesting, maybe I missed it, so, the head part makes sense as an affirmation of human responsibility for our wrongdoing and God. I missed the part where like, God kinda did enough and closes the books, and so that's kind of. Say more about that maybe?
Yeah. Yes, I'll get the slide back on, and I will.
Sorry, Scott, the implication for.
Yes, so the question was about one of those middle last slides I had, talking about hell, and how might some of this apply?
Yeah, I think I just missed.
Yeah.
Some of it maybe, yeah.
So, my point there was that the language of hell, when the scriptures talk about hell, when we talk about hell, imagine hell, metaphorically, it makes sense to me, insofar as it's saying, or reminding us, that there are genuine consequences to our wrongdoing. That when we are sinful, when we hurt other people, and also hurt ourselves in doing so, that all of that has a real weight to it, a real impact, and that we can't simply go with the option of blaming the Father or blaming someone else to absolve ourselves or remove ourselves from responsibility. So when I see passages preaching and teaching about hell, when I see warnings about hell and damnation, when Matthew's going on and on about weeping and gnashing of teeth, and all other kinds of punishments, sheep and goats, right? Rich man and Lazarus. Rhetorically, metaphorically, that makes sense to me as emphatically demanding some responsibility and accountability for our actions. In fact, we do this with each other, right? On this sort of plane of existence. We're all in this, holding each other accountable as best we can, asking and hoping others do the same. As a description of how God treats us, how God sees us, God's response to our horribleness and sinfulness. It doesn't make sense. It simply can't. Augustine, Luther, others can't hold on to hell and hold on to the things they say about God's control of grace, about our lack of free will, about the goodness of God and God's creation and God's plans for redemption. You just can't have all those things. that go together. And so, if you can accept hell as a thing that God is preparing and filling people up with, let's make the right choice, like Pat Robertson would say, then you've accepted a God who is a failure. And a God who accepts being a failure. There are ways that all of us will fail as parents, as spouses, as teachers, pastors, and people kind of have to accept that. I don't accept that for God. I don't think God does either. So yeah, that's the thing. Yeah. So when we get to those passages, as we open those up to people, if we open them up in ways that emphasize our deep responsibility, our inability to pass the buck. I'm down with that. Yeah.
Just to piggyback on that, we have a young adults group, small group, but they could not get beyond the literal heaven and hell.
Right.
And are ready to not continue because they can't expand that, the metaphorical sense. They want to point to the passages that say hell is hell, and if you don't, it's the Pat Robinson thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm going, okay, have you ever thought of it in terms of relational stuff? You know? Can't go there. Yeah, they're not there yet. They're 21 years old, you know, whatever. And just so it's really been a struggle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, the struggle is real. My suspicion here is that this struggle is partly generated by the fact that that's how our world works. People get punished for doing wrong, and they ought to be sometimes. If we don't hold people accountable, then they're make people do worse wrong. They won't get any better if we don't call them to account. So there's a sense in which, yeah, that's kind of how things do work.
Yeah.
Whether they should in all the instances that they do. But to get out of that sort of limited framework and see how that could possibly make sense of God's relationship to us.
Yeah, that's very helpful for our next meeting.
Oh, good. Good. Yeah.
Is forgiveness an all or nothing, or is there something in between?
What I was trying to say the other day is that there are things that are forgiveness adjacent, and there are kinds of reconciliation that aren't forgiveness. And so in those cases, there are gradations, degrees, right?
Of forgiveness.
Especially for our human relationships. I want to say that ultimately with God, forgiveness has to be an all or nothing. And so what we experience in this life often is a piecemeal approach. Not quite the fullness of what that forgiveness looks like or means. What does that mean? Even at my best, when I believe that God forgives me, I don't think I grasp the depth of the things that I have done for which I need God's forgiveness. Even in my highest moment, my deepest Lutheran Augustinian commitment to God's grace, my deepest sense of joy and relief, of hope, I'm fairly well convinced that still pales in comparison to a full, complete understanding of where I've gone wrong and to the extent to which God loves and desires me. And that's just me. Take that to my understanding of how God loves and desires everyone else, and everyone else also goes wrong and needs God's help. Lifetime infinity. So I think that in this life, our forgiveness is often imperfect approximations of an ideal that to me is more of an eschatological ideal.
Would it be possible for our forgiveness to be complete? As humans, are we capable of complete forgiveness?
I don't know. Think about that for a second. Yeah, I mean, I suspect that there's always a little part of me when I offer forgiveness that pulls back on something a little bit. person who forgives the unfaithful spouse always worries a little that they're going to be unfaithful again. That they've made a mistake. That their friends and family are going to ridicule them. The person who doesn't forgive, or who forgives yet breaks the relationship, worries that they made a wrong choice. They didn't try hard enough. So I suspect that all of my experiences and moments of the deepest kind of forgiveness and the best kind of reconciliation I can muster probably always have some tinge of lack, something missing. That's my suspicion, at least. I mean, to shift metaphor slightly, still thinking on the forgiveness one. I know in my heart of heart that I love my children only for their sake. And sometimes it feels like I love them for my sake. When they're being noisy in church, I feel embarrassed. That doesn't seem right to me, even though I think I'm a fairly loving parent. So I sense that the sinful nature or the simulus dicotomy of my life means that all these things are going to be just a little bit off. And that's okay. I'm not looking for purity in this life. But I need to understand what pretty would look like to know how I'm impure, I guess.
Thank you.
Should we get David?
Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna get Hell's Frozen Over joke somewhere here.
What time's campfire?
It's true.
Charlie and I and two other pastors did a 4-part adult education program about a year ago called Journey with Your Pastors Through Hell. It was hell, the devil, stuff like that, right? Antichrist. And I had hell. And I think that is brilliant. And I'm imagining, okay, I don't believe in hell. I think it's nowhere in the Old Testament, barely mentioned in the New Testament, usually it's part of a parable, almost always attached to material wealth and misuse of that. Crazy. But I imagine talking with evangelicals who are like all about hell. Like after Rob Bell's Love Wins comes out, the Southern Baptist Convention at its next conference reaffirms the existence of hell. Not just of hell in general, but as a place of eternal torment. It's like the Southern Baptists are saying, we want everyone to be clear, hell's real and it sucks.
I don't have a sense of distance from God or a place of despair.
Exactly.
Pain, Dante, all the time. But Southern Baptist Dante was.
I imagine being in this conversation with, evangelical like care about or have the conversation and say, so you're willing to say God accepts eternal failure. And then with all of the God of power, just anticipating and processing that does not compute.
Well, you briefly mentioned the good place earlier, and I mean, obviously there's so much progression in that show, it's hard to take out a piece of it and use it as a teaching tool, but there are so many moments there that do illustrate that, the unreconciled relationships, right, that this is a great metaphor for the state of humanity and responsibility, right? But then they mix in all the weird cultural baggage we have about, the torment and the
Demons.
and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Has anybody attempted to do that or something? I think it would be a fascinating experiment.
There have. There were a couple of courses people have taught. One person that actually, Michigan or somewhere, the professor actually got Skur, the guy who made the show,
Yeah.
and it's called the actors, like Kristen Bell, zoomed into the class.
Oh, wow.
So jealous. It's awesome. So people have done that. And those of you who haven't watched the show, the idea basically is during your life, people are keeping track of the good and bad things you do. You have to clear a certain number, an equation cranks out a number. And if you clear it, you go to the good place. If you don't, go to the bad place. And whether it's happiness versus torture. And that's how it works. And the show digs into how problematic that is. One of the points about it is that life is so complicated now. It's almost impossible to keep track of all the points. Because it's like, one of the characters goes insane because he's convinced it was almond milk that did him in because of all the water usage and waste. But he didn't want to drink cow's milk because of cows. It was he's in all of these conundrums of trying to figure out. So it's an awesome show. I won't spoil anything else.
Dave, how would you interpret the second death? Those who have won the victory will not be hurt by the second death. What does that mean?
No idea.
That's why I asked you. Anybody? Okay.
Wasn't teasing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are so many of these passages I feel like, and if Barbara Rossman was here, she was here, right? She talked more about Revelation and lamb power. So there's a lot of ways of interpreting these things, sort of historically, contextually, metaphorically, that give the stories truth and give them weight, give them meaning, and the communities that produce them. People who are persecuted, hoping and waiting for the day when the lamb beats the beast, that kind of stuff, without there needing to be an actual beast and Antichrist driving people down to eternal torment. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me when you were talking about theodicy, which I also really love thinking of that, because they all fail, usually horribly. It's our attempt to take responsibility for God's work, which is a really interesting way of framing it. And I like in a couple places in Paul, where Paul just is willing to, he says it more eloquently than I have no idea, but essentially confesses a mystery, where Paul is just beside himself. In Romans 7, the good I would I do not, the evil I would not I do. And there's, it's consigns it to sin, but there's no explanation. It's just how is this possible, but it is. Or when Paul briefly tries, not do a theodicy, but to sort of make sense of a question. A lot of people wondered if Jesus is Jewish, why did the Jews reject him? What does that mean for Israel and all that? He's 3 chapters of the most impenetrable part of Paul, of trying to explain, well, maybe it's like this, and perhaps it's that, at the end is where we're redeemed, and all of this stuff. And at the end, he's just like, oh, but for the depths of the riches of God. Like this, I have no idea, but I will trust the God I know, Jesus. And I think that, that little bit of humility or room for mystery, always impressed me too. Karl Barth, greatest theologian of the 20th century, next to Aquinas, writes the greatest theological work in history, and he does not finish. I don't think Aquinas finishes either. So the greatest theological minds of the church, who set out to write an explanation of all things under God, at the end of the day, stop writing. Because they know you can't do it. To finish the work is to be unfaithful to the mystery of God. I just think there's something kind of cool about that.
Not to get you both back and forth again, but earlier today, David was talking about this sort of frantic desire to keep doing things, sort of like a busy work, kind of way that I don't have my notes in front of me, but it's this sort of like obsessive consumption and energy and work. Luther uses a Greek word to describe this. It's polypragmosune. It's sort of like, it's a good fancy word, but it just means running about doing all kinds of things, but not the thing you need to be doing. He's convinced that this is what the medieval church is. You're all real busy, no one's calling you lazy. Right? You got a lot of hours filled, a lot of things, don't need to do any of it. It's all kind of a waste. You're not doing the actual one thing you need to do. Right? And to me, a lot of theodicies do the same sort of thing.
Yes.
A lot of energy, trying to do a lot of things. Meanwhile, somebody's suffering right here. Right? And also you're horrible in some ways to be working on it. And you can be defending God's gospel and work on yourself and finding the wounds.
Yeah.
Go do those. Don't do the things that God hasn't done yet.
I think Dan Erlander's The Pointless People kind of speaks to that, and it's a great little resource. You know, he's written all these different, you know, books that are really accessible to congregations, and The Pointless People is one of those.
I know that one. Look that up.
Hell might, not be in the Old Testament and somewhat mentioned in the New Testament, but what do you do about the judgment passages? You know, when all those who will hear the voice of God, you know, eternal life and judgment. What is hell? Is it separation from God? And we have hell here right now. I don't know, you know. Is that a question or is? Yeah.
Sounded like a confession.
I brought heaven here. This is a good example of heaven and hell.
Mannequin marriage.
I like Winston Churchill's concept of hell. If you're going through hell, keep on going.
Or a dinner with, was it Lady Spencer, that you just hated?
Matt, it looked like you were about to ask something.
So, a lot about this. So 15 years ago, my youngest sister shotgunned her husband to death in the kitchen. 4 amazing children. My little sister's probably one of the, I know it sounds strange, but of all of us, the most faithful, the most prayerful, the most Christian. Song like she has a voice of an angel. And mental illness was part of the issue. However, she wasn't considered, it wasn't considered a mental illness crime, so she was sent to prison for 18 years. She would be out in 3 years. I always kind of thought I'd be dead by then, I wouldn't have to worry about it. I mean, not that I wanted to be dead by then, but because I'm the last one standing. I live on the family farm, which she loves. And she's looking forward to coming home to that farm. And I would love to kill the fatted calf and welcome this beloved sister home, who has paid her debt to society and who believes with all her heart that God has forgiven her and is so sad and sorry for what she did. For 45 years, I've lived with an amazing woman, my wife, who's an ordained pastor, and who is not ready to kill the fatted calf and welcome her home to the farm because she's scared, because she's, even though she's embarrassed about it, is, I think, holding back probably total forgiveness and absolution. And I'm not really sure what to do about that. And probably one of the reasons I'm not so sure is I didn't hate Steve, but I really didn't like him. So I've forgiven Cordy, but I maybe haven't forgiven myself for hating Steve, for psychologically abusing my sister. And I'm not trying to make this a therapy session, but I'm just trying to tell you that when it gets to that level, and we're maybe at that level politically in our country right now with our parishioners on both sides of the fence, so thanks to both of you, but maybe even to David to help me hear that about Paul's look at all of that. You know, it's just not. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but it is. This is not easy stuff, and I agree with, I guess, what Ed said about. You know, we're living on hell and earth all the time, so just. Maybe the church, maybe us, all we can do is give a glimpse of, you talk about burning hope, you know, just a glimpse of hope and admit the fact that we've got plenty of hell here on earth. And we have the answer to that, and it's I am the way, the truth, and the life. I mean, the other side with no more tears, no more sadness, no more death, no more shotguns in the kitchen, you know. So just thanks for bringing all of this up, you know.
Can I add something to that? Maybe respond to the whole thing? We had a lady in our church
Do
who.
you want a response, or do you want to just leave it there?
Oh, no, that was not, yeah,
I'll just
thanks,
make sure in this.
Okay, sure.
We had a lady in our church who, when her husband was sleeping, attacked him with a hammer. Went, you know, mental health issue, visited her in prison. She finally came out, and he brought her back home.
God, I wish Gordy had found a hammer that day instead of a 12 gauge.
That scared me to death, how he could do that. And he's cared for her ever since, you know. And I'm not sure how all it ties in, but it's a hard situation. You know, I'm glad Matt shared that, but it's a very hard situation. There's a lot of emotions and stuff tied into this whole thing. Not easy to resolve.
And I am so sorry.
Yeah.
This is so hard. That's a lot to carry. That you've been carrying. And your wife is carrying.
But maybe what I was trying to bring up most importantly is that we can, so this case, it's loving my wife, we can love our parishioners, we can love each other. And one can forgive and welcome, and one's still not there. And maybe that's just, that's life.
Two, there's, and I think Anthony either alluded to this or mentioned more explicitly, there's a distinction between the forgiveness, which is primarily relational, seeing you as good, or the restoration of a relationship, not holding past actions against you in the future, is not the same as saying there are not consequences to behavior. One of them is the prison sentence. Another is fear of people who care about you, but they're still afraid of you. I don't even know that it's not that she hasn't forgiven her. It's in the sense of her wanting her well or wishing her good. But one of the consequences of that violent act is the lingering fear, could you do that again? And I think that distinction sometimes is helpful just to remember.
And as you mentioned, you go to the adultery side, the fear that, can I trust you again?
And I want to say there's an honesty to your wife's position, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's a real easy, and I think wrong-headed approach to Christian forgiveness. We would lift up examples of people who have forgiven horrific evils and say, isn't that wonderful? Go and do likewise.
Yeah, or why can't you?
Right. Which I hope you haven't heard me say at any point over the tweet.
Oh, no.
That's not correct. As I said, there are all kinds of conditions that come. There's always reconciling an art, fullness of forgiveness, and there's forgiveness with conditions. There's just a lot of variables here. Because knowing how to do the right thing in the right way at the right time is really hard. Even in our best efforts, we know we are wrong on a lot of those pieces. And so we do the best we can where we are, as your wife's doing what she is, and your sister where she is. But the fact that each of you can recognize that about the other, to me, is a kind of reconciliation in and of itself. You can try to understand where each person is at, what kind of burdens they're able to bear, how far they can go and how far they can't. And each of you might find some sadness in that and wish that things could be a little bit different in some way. That's where you are, that's where we are.
perhaps that might be a word for a preacher to acknowledge that forgiveness isn't neat and tidy or easy. And that we ought to acknowledge that and recognize it and admit that before we even start preaching any sort of easy answers about it.
Let's, give some thanks to both our professors.